Hello everybody, and happy Valentine's Day. Today I'd like to talk about legal systems for communities, or sovereign nations, if you will. I'm going to talk about an interesting new open source legal system that I learned about called Ulex law and see if it can be implemented, or how it could be implemented, and various things about it. So I've thought about this for a long time. Ever since starting the first intentional community I started like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I don't know, a long time ago. We thought about, okay, what rules do you need to run an intentional community? But then what if that intentional community, if you want it to grow really large and be a small town or a city, or maybe if you want to create a micronation or some kind of sovereign state project, and what kind of rules do you have? So a lot of my friends are anarchists and very anti-state, so they would say, okay, well, anarchy means without rulers, but it doesn't mean without rules. So they agree with me that you need a set of rules to have a society function. And I'm sorry it can't just be the NAP, because obviously there are a million ways the NAP can be interpreted in a million different situations. So you're not just going to have some DAO, decentralized autonomous organization like Stefan Molyneux would talk about, for example. Just one of those and a couple judges, people who know common law pretty well, and they're just kind of applying the NAP to different cases. What you see there is the Dunning-Kruger effect in full effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect, which I've talked about so many times, I found myself falling into it with the whole community rule situation. You don't have any experience in a subject, so you just assume it's simple and that you can do it. You have a very high level of confidence in your ability to pull something off, right? It turns out law is an extremely complicated subject for a reason. Not just because lawyers want to get rich and governments are evil and corrupt. In fact, there's a lot of really, really good important laws because there's a lot of really complicated situations that can arise, even in a simple anarchist, or whatever you want to call it, society, in an intentional community, in a big intentional community, once it starts growing past 100, 150 people. There's a lot of good reasons why they have hundreds of pages of law textbooks governing every aspect. So we're going to look at Ulex law and talk about why this is helpful. If you go to the website for this project, ulex.law, there's like a white paper and stuff, and their basic description says, what is Ulex? It's an open source legal system for special jurisdictions, online markets, ZEs, I don't know what that is, seasteads, and other startup communities. It combines tested and trusted rule sets from private and international organizations in a robust but flexible configuration, right? So it's basically a set of laws, right? And I thought about, well, you could have a community that just has a constitution and just like or like the 10 Commandments from the Bible or something like that. And I thought, oh, that's great. We could just have that, and everything will just flow freely from there. Again, Dunning-Kruger effect, you're going to run into situations where you need laws, and there's complicated situations, which I'll explain a little bit. Anyway, so Ulex is pretty cool. But let's look at an example of what I'm talking about. See if I can find the web page. There's like a community, I guess, that's starting in, they're basically trying to start a zone, not necessarily a specific localized community, but just the general zone. They want to start a community in the area of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. And it says, Declaration of Independence of the Ozarks. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All people should have a right to their body and property, and therefore should not aggress against one another. Aggression justifies the right. Okay, so it's basically your typical libertarian and NAP stuff. There's about 6 points and a paragraph, and that's it. And that's their whole thing. And I think a lot of times anarchists have the Dunning-Kruger effect in full force, and they think all they need is the NAP and a few basic principles, and that's literally it. That's all you need. You don't need any other laws. And Stefan Molyneux, or the more high IQ anarchists, would say, okay, we actually do need complicated systems for a complex society, but we can solve those with DAOs and things like that. But nobody's really come up with a full framework, like everything. How to run businesses, what do you do when products are defective, things like that. So I thought, oh, it would be cool if some government had such a good legal system. You could literally just lift the entire legal system, lift all the laws, their entire code, their criminal code, everything, and just apply that to your community if it's all laws that you agree with, and except have it more done in a non-corrupt way, obviously, or in an anarchist way if that's what you want, where everyone voluntarily consents to it. The problem is governments have thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of unnecessary laws and regulations that are just stupid. So it's like someone needs to basically pick and choose and make a framework that can be applied to a community. And this is what the Ulex people did. So a community can have like a Declaration of Independence like the Declaration of Independence of the Ozark Community, or a constitution, or a Bill of Rights, or something basic like that. Or a Christian community could just adopt the Ten Commandments as their constitution or something, but you're going to need something more. So let's look at the GitHub page for Ulex. Now GitHub is it's a website where they track versions. Basically it's used to write software, to write open source software, and it's very easy to. So all the changes to the code in the software are kind of submitted and approved by people. So there's a team of people who are allowed to approve changes to the code, and you can see who changed it and when and stuff like that. So it's really cool. And people haven't used it that much for legal documents. There's actually some other systems where they take the concept of GitHub and it's better suited to legal systems, but the only ones I've seen like that are not free to use. So GitHub is still open source and free to use. So we basically have the Ulex open source legal operating system, version 1.2. And what is it? It's a list of laws. All right, and it's separated into Section 1 procedural rules and Section 2 substantive rules. And if you look up those terms in law, the procedural rules is what the government and courts are supposed to do, or if you're in an anarchist society, the DAOs or the common law courts, the procedural rules are supposed to use, like the rules of evidence and things like that, right? An intentional community's constitution does not contain anything nearly as complicated as the rules of evidence in a criminal case, which are actually really important for a fair case, right? We've spent hundreds of years, lawyers combined thousands of years of human history coming up with what we have now in terms of rules of evidence for modern courts. And they're pretty darn good. Obviously, in some countries, they're going to be less good and more corrupt, but no reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater, no reason to reinvent the wheel here, right? So those are the procedural rules, and then the substantive rules. So that's basically laws about how people should act in society, and your job in writing those laws is basically to decide how should people act in society. Why do we make this law? Because there's a general idea that if someone does this, it's wrong, right? That's what substantive rules are. So the first section, procedural rules, basically goes about like how you arbitrate disputes, how you choose the judges, costs, appeals, things like that, right? And then it uses the uniform rules of evidence, which the law professor who wrote this basically decided, hey, this to me seems like the best rules of evidence out there, so we're going to use this, right? This document, by the way, this shall we say legal operating system, it doesn't have all the laws written in here. It has a lot of links, right? So we go down into substantive rules, and there's lots of links, and some of them are to law textbooks, and other of them are to PDFs, right? The ones that say ALI are mostly to hardbound law textbooks, and the ones that say ULC, which is the Uniform Law Commission, which is a really cool organization, is mostly available in PDFs, which is great. And the Uniform Law Commission, if you go to their website, it's pretty cool because they're basically an organization dedicated to making laws uniform between states in the United States, which makes sense because you go from state to state. You can freely move from state to state if you're a United States citizen without a visa or anything, obviously. And it's like being able to go between countries in Europe. And basically, if you have slightly different laws in each state, it's really annoying. Like starting a business in one state, the laws are different in another state. Carrying guns in your car between states, you always have to look up the exact laws between each state. So it's really much more helpful. Unless states really have a strong preference to have different laws, it makes no sense to have like slight technical differences in laws that are written by different groups of people in different states. So, and the good thing about this organization is it's totally voluntary. It's not like the European Union, which has usurped a whole bunch of power over individual European countries without the consent of the governed, via appointed officials, non-elected. Like the ULC works to make these laws and then suggests them to the state and to each individual state in the U.S., and they can adopt them if they so choose. But anyway, just to get an idea where some of this stuff comes from, this law professor, who I don't know his political leanings exactly, but the guy who wrote this, and there were others who helped, I'm sure, he did write a lot about crypto in his white paper, so I think he is libertarian-minded individual. And so he went through and found the best law text, what he considered to be the fairest and most logical sets of laws. And for example, I don't know, for property law, we have something that's restatement of property. So basically they look through the common law record. The common law is basically decisions that have been made in court by judges, and they wrote a whole textbook, hundreds of pages, about property law, right? For some reason he chose this edition of a book that was written about that in 1936 and 1940 edition for some reason, right? If you asked him, he might say, oh, well, I read all the ones after that, and maybe they included a lot more eminent domain or gave the state a lot more power. I didn't think that was good. This was the one that made the most sense, right? And below that you have stuff about leases, mortgages, servitude, so basically laws about being able to run a power line through somebody's property and what rights they have, laws about how to formalize an agreement between neighbors to use a shared driveway. It's really helpful to have laws like that, right? The NAP does not cover that, okay? It helps to have these things that we've studied for hundreds of years and come up with these great laws that just make sense rather than having to do it all over again and waiting for a problem to arise before making a rule about it. So cool that this Ulex is basically a whole bunch of laws. And the best thing about it is it's open source and is written in this way. If you don't like certain laws that are in it, you can branch this and make your own version of it, even on GitHub. And you can write notes. You can say, I think he even did this for a couple of them. For example, under tort law, it says the Restatement of Torts, 2nd edition, 1979, except for the section which immunizes government agents from liability for their torts. So he didn't like that part. The rest of it was good, okay? Now, what is tort law? Tort is basically an action that you can take, an action or omission that harms another individual, right? And so a lot of times this goes towards in terms of defective products, like if a car manufacturer manufactures a car that's defective and somebody is hurt because of it, well, now we have to look into, did they do it on purpose? Did they know? Was it because of a supplier actually giving them a defective part, who has liability, how much the liability is? Those are all good things to have. And as your community or a sovereign nation or a micronation gets bigger and bigger and more cult-like and more willing to ignore existing government legal systems, then having a bunch of laws about every kind of situation that can arise, it's going to be really helpful, right? There's going to be a lot less work that you're going to have to do. So as for actually implementing Ulex, I don't know of anybody who's really put forth an effort to implement Ulex law. And of course, if you have a large community that's growing and you don't have laws, you just have, some basic community rules and a contract. Like at Fruithaven, we have a contract between the owners of the property, which is pretty cool. And it has a lot of good stuff in it, but it's not a full legal system at all. And we were talking, I suggested making a constitution for Fruithaven, which we might still do at some point, laying out basic rights. And that's cool. And it kind of goes towards establishing yourself as kind of like a pseudo-sovereign nation or quasi-sovereign nation. But like, if you don't have a full legal system, people will just automatically default to the government legal system, right? Because everyone in the world currently has a government, so with the exception of a few maybe tiny zones, right? And so if you have a big legal system, it's possible that people will ignore the law that your community decides for itself and will just go and take government legal action against somebody else in the community. It's possible, but I think it's a good idea to at least have a legal system in your community so that when people want to use it, they can. And eventually your community might get so big, or eventually the government might even collapse. There could be massive world chaos. And if your community has a functioning legal system that doesn't rely on the government, your community is going to survive because you're going to be able to resolve your problems quickly, where everyone else around you in Zombieland will just be killing each other, right? So to actually implement this, everything that's written on here is great, but everything that's linked, you would have to have a legal library, a law library at your community. And a lot of PDFs that are on here, most of the stuff that's been published by the Uniform Law Commission, a lot of those can be printed out in PDF and spiral bound, so you don't have to buy a bunch of books. Unfortunately, there are a little less than half of the links are from ALI, and those are hardcover textbooks. And that you'd have to dish out, I don't know how much, probably look into it, hundreds of dollars, well over $1,000, possibly more, on law textbooks. So this is something you would only do if you were really serious. If you had a big community and you were really serious about having your own legal system, then you could get a law library, and then people at the community who were interested in this could at least reference these things when they wanted to, and you could have common law courts. You could set up common law courts at your community. People could choose judges for arbitration, just like it's listed in Ulex law, using that process, and then they could simply go to the law library and kind of study the type of law. And I already discussed a few of the things that are in here, but it covers a lot of things. So yeah, defective products, shared blame, personal harm, those are all under tort law. Property law talks about leases, mortgage servitudes, gifts and wills and trusts, talks about competition, restitution and unjust enrichment if somebody is making money in a way that's considered immoral to most society. Employment law. Again, like you could say, a libertarian could say, well, there should be no employment law whatsoever because people agree to employment. It's at-will employment, whatever the terms are. That's a voluntary contract between them and the employer. But you run into all types of situations where, to a moral person, it's very obvious that somebody's being extremely taken advantage of. There's a lot of things that we consider to be generally accepted, that these are just bad employment practices, like making a village for your employees to live in, charging them rent to live in the village, but the rent is almost all of their salary, so they're really basically just kind of putting them into slavery. And Walter Block might be like, well, that's okay because they're voluntarily submitting to it, but not everybody wants to live in a community where everything's just so totally like that, right? So you might actually want to have some basic laws, things that we've studied for hundreds of years, and decided, okay, this is not a good practice. We're gonna say that it's against the law. We're gonna say it's a harmful thing to do to the employee. Again, I know labor laws often are very. I live in a country in Ecuador where the labor laws are very bad for employers, and so it's bad for employees too because it reduces the amount of available employment in the country. Because it makes it too easy for an employee to take advantage of an employer. Right? It's trying to solve a problem but going too far in the opposite direction. Right? But anyways, going on, we have all this stuff about banking, negotiable instruments, funds transfers, letters of credit. So if a community is setting up a bank that's going to issue certain financial instruments, or selling stocks in a community in the company, selling stocks in a company in the community, things like that, it'd be nice to have a set of laws that outlines how to do that in a best practices sort of way, because all you software designers know or engineers know, like, best practices are really great and important. Right? It's raining in the background now. You can probably hear it through my microphone. I live in the rainforest. All right, yeah, it talks about title documents, investment securities, talks about adoptions, parentage, marriage, probate, all kinds of things about nonprofit corporations, cooperative business organizations. So this is great. I don't want to read all of this. Even electronic signatures, there's laws about that. It's really cool to have a basic framework about that, so you don't have to make a bunch of things out of thin air that you know nothing about in a community and wait till you arrive at a problem before making a rule about it. All right. So anyways, I think I've discussed this as much as I really need to. It's a cool thing to look into. I'm interested in exploring this at the communities down here in Ecuador. If anyone else is interested, I know it's a kind of an undertaking to actually really implement it. We would have to spend money printing a bunch of PDFs and then buy a bunch of legal textbooks and have a law library, and then from there on is something I think that could be implemented as a community gets bigger. Then it could be implemented in a serious way. But then, of course, people in the community would have to research what's written in the Ulex law on GitHub and decide if they want to change it or not. If they want to keep it as it is, or if you want to branch it, if you want to make your own version that's maybe a bit more anarchist, or maybe includes, take out certain sections, include other sections, things like that. So you could really go through the whole thing. Could spend a year just having a few people in the community just go through a lot of that material and decide this is what we want for our community, this is what we don't, and then just bam, that's it. You've adopted a whole legal framework. So for years I was thinking about it would be cool if somebody did this, and I just couldn't find it, and maybe I didn't look that hard. And then the other day I was searching on the internet and happened to find this Ulex law project. It's the only one that I could find of its type. I couldn't find anything else like this. This guy obviously put a lot of work into it. He's obviously a legal scholar, and so I appreciate that he put so much time and effort into this, and basically just found the best laws he could that made the most sense and were the least controversial. It's all based on U.S. law, of course, because it's a U.S. law professor, but basically he took the things out he didn't like, didn't include the unnecessary thousands of pages of regulation in every agency. Just basic laws to function, to help to function the most important parts of society. And it helps to overcome the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people don't realize how complicated, but also how necessary all these laws are. It's not necessarily government trying to control every little aspect of your life. It's actually giving you good frameworks for the best ways to do things in the most moral way. And if you don't agree with certain aspects of what's written in Ulex law, you can simply branch it, make a new project with whatever Creative Commons license. I don't know what license they have, but it's an open source software, shall we say. You make a new project, and you put in footnotes, you put exceptions, you remove things, you add things, and make sure sections don't contradict each other, and it's great. Comment below the video if you have any thoughts on this topic. I want to see some communities adopt Ulex law. In the white paper, he talks a lot about crypto communities, online crypto communities adopting it, but I think actually it's something good that a physical community could do. And actually, a framework that I'm trying to start right now is a framework for, it'd be really cool to make an open source framework model for issuing silver or gold-backed certificates at a community, because it's something that on a large government level, we don't trust any governments these days, and why would they do that? But in terms of local currencies, you could make a local currency out of paper, but it'd be even cooler if you have a community vault run by volunteers and you accept silver deposits, and that makes it really easy to transact in silver, because it's a big problem, as I've explained to people here. Nobody knows, like, yeah, those old US dimes and quarters, they're 90% silver. Nobody knows the weights off the top of their head. And then there's 0.9999 rounds with exactly 1 troy ounce, but then there's troy ounce versus grams. You have to do math. The spot price is always given in troy ounce. It's a serious mind frick, shall we say, to use silver in everyday transactions unless you're an expert on it. Or unless there's one standard silver coin currency like there was in the past, the countries that did it, which we don't have really now. So silver certificates, you can standardize it. You can just have it all in grams, 5, 10, 20, 30 gram, 50 gram silver certificates, and more for larger amounts. And then it could be used for everyday transactions. People will just exchange their certificates. It would work good in a small, high-trust community. It would be great. So leave your comments and questions below the video. And make sure you check out freehaven.org, libertyhomesteads.com, amazonfruitfestival.com, terrafruitus.com, and swing on down and visit us here in southeast Ecuador in the Gualaquiza area. It's a great high elevation area, remote, rural, good for surviving the apocalypse and Noah's flood.